can you hear? All right. So I'm really excited to be welcoming David Kinitz as a guest lecturer for the BSW students at York University. David, we have a long-standing friendship as well as academic professional kind of collaboration relationship. So I'm Kinnan, you know that. I go by he or they pronouns, and I would love if you could give all of us just a brief introduction to you and your work.
Thanks, Kinnan. My name's David. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a York social work graduate, which is why I'm very excited to be talking to York social work students today. I'm currently a PhD candidate in the School of Public Health Sciences at U of T, which is where I not actually originally met Kinnan. It was when Kinnan did a guest lecture for my social work class back during my MSW. And then I followed in Kinnan's footsteps at U of T. So my project is around precarious employment among queer people. And that's going to be my dissertation topic that I talk about today.
Thanks so much for the introduction, David. And yeah, I remember that class fondly and meeting you. So I would love to just dive right in and talk about your research project and a little bit of background and what interested you in precarious employment in queer communities.
Good question. I think my research topic really borders well the public health and the social work arenas. So I think I really wanted to stay true to the social work education and background and the practice that I had. My very first job in social work was at an employment center at the John Howard Society, and I really enjoyed the work that I did there. And I've always been interested in some advocacy work around queer and trans populations, especially around poverty, and also just my own positionality there as well. I have interests in this research. So my actual title of my project is called The Pathways to Low Wage and Precarious Employment, a Narrative Inquiry Among Gay, Bisexual, and Queer Men. And I think just with my personal interests, my political interests, and as well my research and academic interests, I think that's where my project mainly stems from. Yeah, I think that would answer that.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing. And I really want to hear a little bit more about your method or methodology of narrative inquiry. But first, I wondered if you could speak just a little bit more about like your personal connections or political advocacy work and like how that led you into this project.
Yeah, I think it was actually when I was at York, I learned that the personal is political. And I extend that to research as well. So I would say my research is both personal and political. I forget where I read that specifically while I was at York, but I wanted to engage research that hopefully impacts my own community as well, both in terms of my community, with, I said, the anti-poverty work that I've done and my past work as a social worker, but as well my positionality as a queer man who has been faced by discrimination in the workplace, been fearful of homelessness or living in poverty while coming out to family, things like that, as well as being precariously employed myself. I'm sure you can understand throughout the PhD life, you probably, most research assistants and things like that also experience some form of precarious employment when you're trying to first graduate from social work school after my undergrad. I definitely couldn't find, it was all 3-month contract after contract, and that impacts people's mental health a lot. So I just wanted to learn more about precarious employment. So that's probably my more personal tie to it. I think especially my educator self comes on here, and I want to at least mention that a lot of us in social work and in critical social sciences take up topics that are both personal to us and political and more value charged. And I think it's important for us just to be mindful of the impact that has on ourselves as well. So I just want to do a shout out to that as in terms of not just like practice self-care, but be very mindful of how research can be personal, and that extends beyond just the actual research project and into our personal lives as well. Yeah.
You're so right. And that really resonates with me too. And, how I became interested in trans health research and improving access to gender affirming care, because that, that was, some challenges that I experienced personally as well. So yeah, thanks for sharing. And it makes me wonder a little bit about like your overarching kind of paradigm or the like epistemological framing that I guess you would like, how would you describe that as influencing your own project?
Hmm. That's a good question. So the paradigmatic kind of framing would be in a critical social science paradigm. Within that, I think the reason I find that so attuned with my own, where I situate myself, is the social justice or emancipatory kind of undertones to that type of research and challenging the taken for granted assumptions, whether that's around queer and trans communities and the history of pathologizing those communities and not valuing certain lives the same as others. So I think that's where a lot of my work stems from. So even if I'm doing more post-positivist research where I just want to answer the more themes and try to understand what is precarious employment, that doesn't necessarily challenge critical social norms, but it comes from a place of trying to understand how this impacts certain marginalized groups more than others, specifically around, like, as you were talking, LGBTQ plus populations. A lot of research prioritizes cis gay men's research over other populations to the extent that they're left out, which is trans, bisexual, two-spirit populations who are often left out of research. So I think my critical social paradigm, even if I'm operating out of maybe a post-positivist kind of research question of what does this look like, I think those critical social paradigm underlines a lot of what I do.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And yeah, I think thanks for kind of perfectly explaining your process. It's really illuminating for me. I'm wondering, so do you have kind of like one specific research question that you're examining now, or are there a set or like a subset of different research questions?
Good question. I kind of have two research questions with some sub questions underneath. I use more so objectives of my research rather than research questions specifically. Um, I'll just say these are my current research questions. It has taken over 2 years to formulate these current research questions, and I'm sure they will change over the next 2 years as well by the time I finish my project. And I think that's part of being in a critical social paradigm as well, is I haven't yet heard from the community that I'm working with to the full extent as I would like to. And I want my research questions to be shaped by the stories that I'm hearing from them as well. So I'll just say this is very preliminary in terms of my research objectives, but they're to explore the labor market and economic insecurity experiences of gay, bisexual, and queer men. And so to be able to do that, I hope to identify and tell an overarching story of the pathways and mechanisms that lead queer men to economic insecurity and precarious employment. So I kind of want to take a lifespan approach of like what led you to this point in your life. And then after that point, I want to talk about what are the mental health and other impacts of precarious employment and generate some kind of theoretical transferability around those kind of mental health consequences of labor market experiences of queer and trans people.
Wow.
So that's kind of part one. And then part two is more so the very explicit critical social science kind of questions of, I want to critically examine the experiences of these men as they're shaped and facilitated by the social, political, and economic kind of context that surround them. So that would be whether it's the neoliberal ideology, whether it's heteronormativity, classism, sexism, things like that. So that I want to try to uncover those as well within the stories that people tell me.
Wow. So it sounds like you're really taking like a multi-level analysis, like all the way down to the local or micro level and like tracing that to the more structural level.
Mm-hmm.
That's really, yeah, that sounds brilliant.
Yeah, so starting with like, what does this look like for your life? And I want to be more descriptive around that and explain what precarious employment looks like, because we might assume that it's a negative thing and it might be actually a protective factor for some queer people, but we don't know that. And so I just want to maybe be more descriptive and talk about the individual level, but I also want to definitely explore those more structural macro level pieces to it.
That sounds great. So David, you mentioned a little bit about like you haven't heard enough from the community or as much as you'd like to hear, or so it sounds a little bit to me like you are doing a bit of community-based research or some kind of there's a community engaged element to your project. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I like your distinction there, Ken, in terms of whether it's community-based research or community engaged research, or what does that actually look like? So definitely starting my PhD, I started with really good intentions of doing a community engaged, like community-based participatory action research. But to do that authentically and do that good that respects the populations that I want to work with is really challenging to do within a 2-year time frame that someone's given to complete their PhD research. So with that, I decided to say that I use elements of community-based research rather than calling it community-based research itself as the study methodology. So like my topic comes from a report that's co-written by community members. So it was written by the Canadian Coalition Against LGBTQ Poverty, which was researchers as well as community members, people with lived experience of poverty in the queer and trans community, came up with these research priorities. So in that way, my research topic comes from that. But at the same time, I'm the one who came up with my research questions specifically. And that wasn't necessarily in consultation with community. So I don't like to say that it's community-based research when the research questions themselves don't necessarily come out of the community. But I do work with community partners in town. So I'm partnered with the neighborhood group and St. Stephen's Community House. So that's like a conglomerate of a bunch of different employment agencies in town who work with people who are facing precarious employment. I'm hiring peer researchers and things like that as well, and hope to get their input on the methods that I use in terms of my interview guides and things like that. So it's definitely community engaged and community informed, but it's just not necessarily a full-fledged community-based research project.
Thanks so much for explaining kind of the differences, and just so that folks get an appreciation for just the level of involvement that you were already doing for your PhD project. Like I think that's even a little bit unheard of, and you really are going the extra mile within your PhD program. Like I know even personally for me, like I have been involved in lots of community-based or community engaged research, but personally, I was kind of advised or discouraged from doing community engaged research for the PhD, just because it does add, it could potentially add like an extra year to your program. So, it is a lot more resource intensive, even though we do really value it and think that it's, it is a more potentially a more ethical approach to doing research.
Absolutely. I was in a very similar boat to you, and I was slightly discouraged or swayed towards not doing a full community-based research because of the commitments to do it well. But I am also reminded that the PhD project is my first full research project, and hopefully there's many to come where I can do really genuine and authentic community-based research with the community where it's led by community. Instead of, because I'm the one who's going to be publishing my dissertation, it's not necessarily the community that is controlling that. So that's where I want to be more ethical around that.
Right. And also, I mean, it's also really great that you're able to kind of collaborate with social service agencies. And I feel like like with your background in social work, that's really like kind of an advantage that you bring, because I would assume that you probably, just have a bit of insider knowledge in working in social services.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that actually in terms of my research. Part of a stream of my research, more so just because this part did come out of the community, is that they wanted to learn what staff's perceptions of precarious employment with these populations is. So I will be doing interviews with social workers and policymakers that are from the social work field as well, to just try to get their insights and provide more context into the phenomena that I'm going to look at. But I'm really excited to be working with the social service agencies and kind of go back to, I don't know, it's just weird that it was my very first job out of my social service work diploma that was working in the employment sector. And it's really kind of feel like I've gone back home a little bit, which is nice.
Yeah, you've really come full circle.
Yeah.
So now you're making me think about your kind of sampling strategy. It sounds like you're talking with individuals with lived experience, like men, queer, gay, bisexual men with experience of precarious employment, as well as a whole bunch of other stakeholders. Could you say a little bit more?
Yeah, so my sampling specifically, so I guess I use purposive sampling, where I will be using a mix of different types of sampling strategies like snowball sampling as well. So my initial sampling will be looking to queer, bisexual, gay men who are actively seeking out services, employment services with the neighborhood group. So I will be recruiting from the clients there or the job seekers there. And then after that, I will be using more snowball sampling and recruitment from the community so that they're not all coming from one spot, because I want to have a more representative sample as well. And so within gay, bisexual, and queer men, we want to get a more representative sample of people who are also higher rates within precarious employment. So people of color, we want to look at new Canadians as well, who are more so in precarious employment, people with disabilities, young people. There's all these intersecting identities that we want to make sure that we are highlighting. And especially, as I said earlier, the people that are often left out of research, like trans, bisexual, and two-spirit communities as well, who are often left out of research. I want to make sure that I'm able to not just perpetuate this idea that, oh, we're only speaking about cis gay men. So hopefully that we can have a more representative sample that way as well. So that's my primary sample population. And then after I collect most of those interviews, then I will look to more so the service providers who are offering services to more contextualize those stories of the individuals who I'm talking to first.
Oh, I love that. Sounds really, really great.
Mm-hmm.
And so now, I guess, since we've finished talking about the data collection, I want to hear more about narrative inquiry. You're becoming quite the expert in narrative inquiry,
I
aren't
love
you?
narrative inquiry. I'm really interested in narrative inquiry, specifically critical narrative inquiry. So I'm able to incorporate more the critical social science paradigm into narrative inquiry, which I really like. And that's starting with the stories of the people who are most marginalized and often left out of research. So initially, like, I was like, oh, I just want to learn about this phenomenon. I could have talked to workers and employers and things like that too. But you're starting with the people who are often not, their voices aren't heard as much. So I wanted to start with the queer men themselves. So narrative inquiry is kind of, we understand people's experiences and people understand their own experiences through the telling of stories and through hearing stories and things like that. So I also find the data collection methods that narrative inquiry uses a little more just human. They're more conversational. It's almost like this podcast kind of thing that you're having right now is like, yes, there's some guiding questions, but we can also just bounce back and forth. And if I feel something's important to talk about, then I have the kind of liberty and freedom to be able to talk about what I want to as a participant. And I really like that. So I'm going to just ask participants, like, tell me about what led you to this point in your life. And they get to talk about the important parts of their life that has led them to this specific point without me asking very targeted questions that are going to lead the research that might not illuminate some of the important findings that we might not get otherwise. And narrative inquiry specifically, I love how it can be represented. So I think we've all read probably a research paper that says, these are the 4 key themes that we found by interviewing people. It is that they face stress in employment, that they face anxiety, and whatever. So they list kind of these, and by the end, you're like, okay, this was really informative and good to know, but I'm also half asleep. I don't feel powered with social justice that I want to do more. And I think by telling people's stories and being true to their stories and the retelling of people's stories is really important. So I get to write creative nonfictions and combine people's stories to tell something that evokes like empathy and a sense of understanding of the stories that people have lived experience. And I think that's really important when we're working with marginalized groups, especially, is to stay true to their experience and not chop it up into different themes and say, oh, I'm going to focus on this part of your story without encompassing it in a larger context of your life. So I find it really fun, not to be a total nerd about narrative inquiry, but it has some really like, that I find it aligns really well with critical qualitative research, and it's more emancipatory kind of ways. And even telling stories is so much more accessible than the typical standard scholarly journal article that is not able to be read by so much of the population who isn't as specifically educated in one type of thinking. So everyone can hear and understand a story and the plot lines and the kind of the themes throughout the stories that people experience. So I really like narrative inquiry, but I'm happy to answer more questions about it, but I'll stop rambling for now.
No, I love the rambling, and yeah, I would like to learn more about narrative inquiry. So this is really helpful for me as
Yeah,
well.
it's so fun.
So thank you. Um, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more. You've been touching on this a bit, but a little more about how like the potential implications of your project to social workers, like either social work students or social work organizations.
Hmm. So I think this is why we do research, right? So it has impact, it has implications for real meaningful change, hopefully. Yes, it's good to fill a knowledge gap. We can say, oh, I read the literature and this is missing, we should know about it. That's important, but I think more important is what impact does it have for the community that you're working with, and not necessarily studying them, but working with them. So I think it has practice implications for social workers specifically. Like I said in my first job with working in employment centers, I don't know like how I should have changed my practice as a social worker, social service worker, um, working with different populations. So I worked with all the folks that came through my door who are job seekers the same way. So hopefully we can inform like a more best practices of working with certain marginalized groups and try to understand the specific experiences that they might face when we say, oh, just go apply to this job and this job, when not thinking of the certain sectors that might be more open or not open to certain demographics. Um, yeah, so for my research specifically, I know the community organizations that I'm working with have some very high expectations of the outputs of how I'm going to help inform and educate their current social workers and job coaches of what they should do to do their job better. And they're very involved with that, which I appreciate. They're holding me highly accountable already before we even collect data. But this research comes from advocacy work as well with policymakers and employers. What employers don't necessarily know the practices that they are doing that hinders certain populations from getting jobs with them, maybe, or having sticking with a job for a longer period of time. Maybe there's experiences that are happening that they don't know about. So hopefully we can inform both like the practice of social work for social work students, but as well just employers and policymakers, because we know that there's policies that protect queer and trans people from discrimination in the workplace. But at the same time, we know that queer and trans people still experience extreme amounts of discrimination in the workplace. Like, why is that? Where are the gaps in the policy not working? So hopefully there's some policy implications there as well that are, I would argue, is still social work practice, because a lot of social workers go into working in policy. Um, so I think there's lots of different implications for social work across the direct practice, and then as well so the more macro oriented practice.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I wonder, because you're talking about the implications or kind of how to mobilize the knowledge, and it has such real potential for change, and at the same time potential to really impact people in a day-to-day basis, like people who are experiencing
Mm-hmm.
poverty or precarious employment. So I'm wondering, like, what are the key like knowledge pieces you're planning for, or have you started to formulate your knowledge translation plan yet?
Yeah, knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization. I feel like they're the hot words to be able to get funding, at least. So we were lucky recently to secure some funding for specifically knowledge mobilization. And I think that's the hard part as well about doing research. Researchers on their CV or their resume, we cite articles that were published in peer-reviewed journals, and we cite academic conferences that we've been to, but what doesn't get enough clout is the actual work that goes into mobilizing kind of the information that you've actually learned from your research, so that it's not just benefiting the academic community, but it's informing the work that happens, I guess, on the ground, or however you want to say that. So for my project, we were able to hire 2 peer researchers and a master's level student to be able to work specifically on knowledge mobilization. What that looks like, I still want to do some more consultation with the community partners. So far, we've said that we would make a video. So just a short clip, like maybe 3 to 5 minute video on the best practices of working with job seekers who are LGBTQ or who identify that way, and as well for employers as well. We want to have a little video of how to educate employers to make better and safer spaces for the LGBTQ employment labor force. And then we'll have a website where we kind of hopefully have all this information together as well. But that's preliminary what we have. But again, I hope to work more with the community to see how we can do it, because I'm not a very creative person. And I think that I definitely want to get more from the community, especially the queer men job seekers that I want to work with more.
Yeah, thanks so much. That sounds like a really well-rounded and also ambitious knowledge mobilization plan. And you know, I really wish you lots of great luck and success with the project. And I know that it's going to make a big difference in people's lives.
Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like this is. Do you have any other like kind of points that you wanted to leave us with?
I took so many point form notes that I was like, I could talk about this and talk about this. But it's not every day that you just get an open soapbox to be able to talk about your own research. So I appreciate the half an hour of space to just talk about my research. I think I just would circle back to my point earlier. If it was just impart a little piece of something for social work students who are going to move forward, is when you're doing, whether it's practice or research, people seem to think of research as really removed from practice. And I'd encourage social work students to look at research opportunities, but also just be mindful of the emotional and mental burden of doing both things. And we all want to support the populations that we work with, but we also come with a background of why we want to work with these populations. So as I said about my background for wanting to improve the lives of LGBTQ plus communities is very personal. So it also has mental, emotional, and other impacts on our personal lives. So I just would want to nail that point home, is just to have some sort of plans and have mentors that are more senior than you that you can talk to about how you can work around certain strategies, but also while being mindful of the impact of research on Mark. But just be mindful of the impact it has on you as well as the community that you're working with, I guess, is where I would leave my soapbox for today.
Yeah, I think that is a really, really important point to leave on, for sure. I absolutely agree with you, David.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to thank you. I think we're all going to learn a lot from you. I love talking about your project, and I am really looking forward to hearing more. So thanks so much, and we can end it there.
Thank you
I'll
so much.
turn the recording off.
Appreciate it.